Those countries not fortunate enough to form partnerships with the United States in the stormy years to come will have to navigate the harsh seas of change on their own. Some of them will be forced, whether due to privation or opportunity, to strike out beyond their borders to secure what they need or take what they want. They will be the active, and often aggressive, players in the new age, out to put their stamp on the world. Populated Eurasia is a vast wedge, anchored in the west by the North European plain, in the south by the Sea of Marmara region, the city-states of the Middle East, and the vast green of the Indian subcontinent, and in the east by the timeless civilizations of the Chinese. The North European plain funnels open from only 200 miles wide at the Polish Gap to over 1,500 by the time it reaches central Belarus and Ukraine. Moving west from coastal China, the arid interior gives way to a veritable sea of grass. Moving northwest out of the Indian subcontinent requires navigating a couple of mountain passes and plateaus that ultimately give way to the steppes of Central Asia. Central Eurasia has absolutely no meaningful geographic barriers, and from one end to the other it is over 3,000 miles long. Inland continental plains suffer from high winds, brutal winters, broiling summers, and fickle precipitation. Many of the lands are marginal for human habitation. It is a place of poverty. The rivers are as hostile as the land, flowing away from the arable portions rather than through them, with the land's utter flatness and the weather's unpredictability generating constant challenges of flood and drought. The central mass of somewhat usable land is over 3,000 miles east to west, and typically about 500 miles north to south. It may not be a third as productive per acre as the American Midwest, once droughts, floods, locusts, and transport and storage loss are factored in, but it is the greatest stretch of flatland on the planet and possesses a combined population of a major power. The lack of reliable weather combined with the lack of local barriers to movement make it easy for any piece of civilization to fall to forces natural or man-made. Any people who rise in this harsh landscape crave what bits of security they can find or wrestle out of the earth, or from each other. It is a land where governments are local, and where raiders of every epoch have swept fast and loose across the grasslands. Combine that large population with low capital generation, and the result is limited funds for infrastructure, education, and market formation, restraining everything from the productivity of the labor force to the effectiveness of the army. It is a land where only numbers matter. It is a land where only the hordes hold sway. And in those rare instances when some power is able to unite the lands under a single government, the civilized bastions on the hordeland's periphery shiver in fear. This is the land of Attila the Hun, of Genghis Khan, of Tamerlane, of Joseph Stalin. Occupying most of that territory today is the Russian Federation, one of the most insecure countries of the contemporary world. While it is arguable that no Central Eurasian power can ever truly be secure, there are two things that a power needs if it is to truly command the hordelands. The first requirement is that the power control all of the hordelands. While Russia remains one of the largest geographic entities in human history and holds the title of largest country in the contemporary world, it actually needs nearly 3 million additional square miles of territory if it is to be even reasonably secure. Just as any hordeland's power can push into any of Eurasia's 3 major civilized zones, any of Eurasia's 3 major civilized zones can push into the hordelands. The Baltic coast, the Polish Gap, the Bessarabian Gap, the Black Sea, the coastal strips of the Caucasus, the Central Asian Corridor, and the Tien-Altai Gap are all points where the hordelands are vulnerable and where invasions have flowed in both directions. During the Soviet period, the Russians commanded every mountain, water, and desert barrier at the hordelands' extremes, giving them command over every single access point to their lands. They could anchor in those barriers and concentrate forces on the gaps, making them as secure as a hordeland's power could be. The day after the Soviet collapse, the Russians controlled but 2. With the capture of the Crimean Peninsula in February 2014, they now control 3. The second requirement is that a successful hordeland's power must have an actual horde. During the Soviet period, the Russians had 180-odd million Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, East Germans, and other Central Europeans to use as cannon fodder to guard their western borders. They controlled all three of the Transcaucasian republics, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, using them as a 16 million strong series of highland speed bumps. They reached south across Central Eurasia's productive lands, the Russian wheat belt, and commanded the 50 million strong Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, Turkmen, and Tajiks to caulk up the southern frontier. All of these peoples and more have now broken away. In just a few years, the Soviet population was sliced by nearly 2/3, with many of those peoples now in charge of their own countries that share the Hordelands with the Russians. What's left over is disappearing. With the Soviet collapse, the bottom fell out of the Russian birth rate. What rebound has occurred can almost wholly be chalked up to the echo of the perestroika baby boom of the mid-1980s. Within 5 years, it will be the far smaller generation of post-Cold War births who will be parents, and there simply are not enough of them to sustain a Russian population at even half its current size. HIV and multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis run rampant through the Russian population, with most of the cases concentrated in the 15 to 35 age group. Even Russia's population pyramid is deceptively positive, as it contains the data for the Russian national population as a whole, not the Russian ethnic population. While many of Russia's conquered populations escaped the Russian yoke with the Soviet collapse, many others remain within contemporary Russia's borders. In particular, Turkic Muslim populations like the Tatars, Bashkirs, and Chechens are young, vibrant, and growing. Their data are blended in with the ethnic Russians, who are rapidly aging, diseased, and not reproducing. By 2040, the Russian national population will almost certainly have shrunk below 120 million. The average age of male mortality in Russia is 59, or at least it was in the mid-2000s, which is when the last reliable demographic data escaped Russia's Federal State Statistics Service. Russia won't even be able to maintain what it has, much less reach for more, within a few short years. Russia's challenge is straightforward, if not simple. Its demographic decline is so steep, so far advanced, and so multi-vectored that for demographic reasons alone, Russia is unlikely to survive as a state, and the Russians are unlikely to survive as a people over the next couple of generations. Russia has at most 8 years of relative strength to act. If it fails, it will have lost the capacity to man a military, to maintain a sizable missile fleet, to keep its roads and rail system in working order, to prevent its regional cities from collapsing, to monitor its frontier. The most effective use of this time would be to attempt to re-anchor in as many of Central Eurasia's border regions as possible, allowing Russia to concentrate forces in the Hordelands access points. Success would doom Russia to a slow-motion demographic disintegration from within. Failure would leave Russia open to hostile forces along all of its borders. The first is a recipe for death over several decades. The second is a recipe for death over 1 or 2. It is extremely likely that Russia lacks the strength to plug all of the gaps in its frontier, so it will have to prioritize. Here is the order I see Russia acting to attempt to preserve its existence. Russia's single largest concern is Ukraine. Ukraine occupies the single most productive portion of the Russian wheat belt, the area farthest south and with the most reliable rainfall. As Russia's manpower and capital shortages mount, maintaining a grip on the lowest input, highest output lands will become of increasing importance. Together with Moldova, Ukraine commands the Bessarabian Gap. Control of the gap would limit the ability of a resurgent Turkey to threaten Russia's core territories. Ukraine holds the largest population of ethnic Russians outside of Russia. True even if one considers the Crimea part of Russia and not part of Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine's industrial base is directly adjacent to Russia's. Combining them would assist all portions of the Russian economy to last a bit longer. Ukrainian infrastructure transport nearly half of Russia's oil and natural gas exports to Europe, making Ukraine an energy tool whose political leverage is nearly as valuable as its financial income. The Ukrainian border is only 300 miles of wide-open flatlands from Moscow, making Ukraine, at a minimum, valuable as a buffer. The only truly navigable river in the former Soviet Union, the Dnieper, flows through Ukrainian territory, flows south, and allows Ukraine to integrate economically with the lands of the Black Sea, the Sea of Marmara, and the world beyond. The river not only makes Ukraine the most potentially capital-rich portion of the Hordelands, it also makes it the only portion that can perhaps seek a destiny independent of Moscow. Russia dare not let that happen. The Crimean Peninsula commands the mouth of the Dnieper and is home to Russia's only true warm-water naval base, Sevastopol. As long as Crimea and Sevastopol are in Russian hands, Ukraine cannot make a true bid for economic independence, and naval powers, most notably Turkey, cannot dominate the Black Sea. Russia's efforts to re-anchor started in the Crimea in early 2014. They will not end there. In any form, an independent Ukraine is a threat to Russia, but it is only the first threat Russia must address. The second most critical region is the northern European frontier, home to Poland, Belarus, and the Baltic trio of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Collectively, these 5 states command Russia's exposure to the North European plain, as well as the Baltic coastline and the fate of Russia's second city, St. Petersburg. Russia must at a minimum neutralize this region. Poland and the Baltic trio are pathologically hostile to Russia, with extremely good reason. The Russians, Soviets, occupied all of them for 2 generations. The 4 not only collaborate closely to resist Russian influence, but are also increasingly partnering with 2 other countries historically famous for doing so with more success: Denmark and Sweden. Russia's key advantage is Belarus, which suffers from a culture cringe that is somewhat similar to Stockholm Syndrome. Belarus suffered under Soviet times just as much as the other occupied peoples, but the Belarusians are the only former Soviet people who actually want to be Russian. They do not see partnership with, or occupation by, Russia as necessarily a negative. A Russian-Belarusian partnership or merger doesn't unilaterally solve Russia's North European plain problem. The third target is lightly populated Kazakhstan. While large portions of the Russian wheat belt lie in Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan's role in Russia's future is primarily as a buffer region. It exists in a sort of no man's land between Russia's more densely populated European territories and the Turkic peoples of Central Asia to the south and the Chinese to the east. Moscow doesn't need Kazakhstan to be robust, or even to be a successful state. It just needs it to continue existing. So long as there is an independent Kazakhstan, there is no one breaking down Russia's back door. Finally, there is the Caucasus, perhaps the world's most unforgiving crucible of ethnic hostility. Imagine the pain of the Balkans, but inject it with the gentle mercies of the Huns, Persians, Mongols, and Russians, and then let it fester for a few centuries. Suffice it to say that Russia rightly fears that Turkish and Persian influence, or worse, will penetrate through the mountains and turn Russia's various Turkic and Muslim peoples against it. This is in essence what happened with the Chechen Wars in the 1990s. The Caucasus is a fractured and fractious region, and maintaining control would require precisely the sort of manpower-heavy effort that Russia will find increasingly difficult. Russian troops will certainly be used, but Moscow will use what money, technology, weapons, and intelligence it has to bolster multiple allied populations throughout the Caucasus region. The Armenians, the Abkhaz, and the Ossetians in particular. And as hostile influences and forces push into the region, the Russians will beat a fighting retreat behind the bodies of its falling allies. The specific order in which Russia addresses these concerns will likely be determined by the level of European and American non-diplomatic opposition. The Russians have already used their centuries-old propaganda tactic of protecting minorities to seize the Crimea and spark rebellions in eastern Ukraine. While ever-shifting economic, political, and military pressure prise the Ukrainian state apart, the Russians will begin work on the Caucasus, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, targets that generate far less concern in the West. Once those areas are pacified, the Russians will return to Ukraine, rescuing those in the Russified East and South who ask for help. In the Western Ukraine, invasion, accompanied by appropriate propaganda of course, will be necessary. After that will come the true challenge: the EU and NATO members of Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states.